On the 18th of May 2012, amateur climber Shriya Shah-Klorfine set out from a camp on the slopes of Mount Everest to achieve a childhood dream. For most of her life, she had wanted to summit Mount Everest. Now, as she began her hike into the freezing void of the death zone, she was closer than ever to that goal. She was confident. She was determined. Nothing would stop her from making the summit. But, in the end, it was this very determination that would ultimately lead to disaster on the slopes of Everest. At just 9 years old, Shriya Shah-Klorfine saw the summit of Everest for the first time. She was on a helicopter sightseeing flight, a treat arranged for her by her parents, who were right there alongside her to experience it. Awestruck by the vast and snowy peak, Shriya asked her father why they weren't climbing the mountain themselves, and received the simple answer that climbing Everest was very difficult. Undaunted, Shriya replied that she would one day climb that mountain. In the years following that helicopter ride, Shriya pursued other goals. She attended university in her home country of Nepal, and then took a job as a purser on board a cruise ship. There she met and fell in love with her future husband, jazz musician Bruce Klorfine. They were soon married and living together in his home city of Toronto in Canada, where she became a fashion buyer and started her own business. It wasn't until she was in her early 30s that her thoughts turned again towards the mountain she had seen and sworn to climb as a child. Now, as an adult, it was time to realize this dream. Despite no relevant climbing experience, she declared to her friends and family that she would soon be tackling the highest mountain peak in the world. In deciding to climb Everest, she was setting herself an immensely dangerous goal. The route to the top of the mountain is fraught with danger. Climbers must pick their way over deep crevasses on precarious ice ladders, master steep and slippery climbs, and risk passing through dangerously unstable ice falls. And they must do all this while suffering from altitude sickness. Even normally fit and healthy climbers are likely to experience debilitating exhaustion, shortness of breath, pounding headaches, and fuzzy thinking as they make their way up the mountain. To make progress, many climbers have to transit back and forth between several camps, taking weeks to acclimate to the changing altitude. When they finally reach Camp 4, the closest established camp to the summit, the most dangerous part of their trek is still ahead of them. They must then make their way to the top of the mountain and back again in a single day, through an area so hazardous it is referred to as the death zone. Here there is just 1/3 of the oxygen found at ground level, meaning that all but the very fittest climbers must rely on bottled oxygen to breathe. The path to the top is narrow and frequently overcrowded. Climbers on a summit push are locked in a constant life-or-death battle with exhaustion and hypothermia. Indeed, the final miles of the climb are littered with the bodies of climbers who have perished during their summit attempts. Their remains cannot safely be retrieved, and so stay, preserved by cold, as grim landmarks for the mountaineers who follow in their footsteps. Despite all this danger, Shriya was determined to make it to the top. As her husband, Bruce Klorfine, remarked in a later interview, if she wanted something, there was nothing you could say to stop her. And so, Shriya Shah-Klorfine began to plan her expedition. She was aware that climbing Everest would likely be the most physically taxing thing she would ever do, and so spent many hours in training. She went on daily long hikes in the countryside around Toronto and put in hour after hour training at a local climbing gym. In addition to this, she also sought to raise money to fund her climb. She had booked with Utmost Adventure Trekking, a brand new guiding company whose services were less costly than their more experienced competitors. Despite this, she still needed approximately $40,000 to cover their fee, and a further $60,000 to cover airfares, permits, and her own climbing equipment. Her attempts to fundraise were largely unsuccessful. She rented climbing gear for a photo shoot, and then had the resulting shots edited to produce a promotional picture of her standing on the slopes of Everest. She put together a website to solicit donations and ran several local fundraising events. These attracted some media attention, with a focus on her being the first Canadian woman of South Asian origin to summit Everest, but barely made a dent in the total she needed to raise. Becoming desperate, she and her husband decided to take out a second mortgage on their home to cover the costs of her climb. On the 20th of March 2012, Shriya set out to realize her dream. She flew to Nepal, spent a week resting, gathering her equipment and acclimating in Kathmandu, and then began her trek up the mountain on the 27th of March. It very quickly became apparent that she was not as fit as most other climbers on the mountain. Her progress was agonizingly slow, with sections that took most climbers around 4 hours taking her 7. In an attempt to assist her, her guides introduced supplemental oxygen much earlier than they normally would. She also required a great deal of instruction and guidance. Her sessions in the climbing gym had not taught her, for example, how to use crampons or other alpine climbing gear. She had to learn these skills on the slopes of Everest. Despite these difficulties, Shriya made progress from one camp to the next. She was determined and proud of every bit of progress towards her goal. At the various camps along the way, she arranged for a promotional banner featuring the photograph she had edited of her on the slopes of Everest to be displayed on the exterior of the Utmost Adventure trekking tents. By the time she arrived at Camp 4, the last camp before the summit, her guides had become uneasy. The owner of Utmost Adventure Trekking, and the most senior Sherpa in the group, decided against taking Shriya to the summit, fearing that her slow pace would put her and themselves in danger. Shriya was undaunted and insisted on attempting the summit, but with the most experienced people in her group having declined to take her, she was left to do so with 2 of the more junior, less experienced guides. On the evening of the 18th of May, she set out, edging slowly up the mountain one step at a time. She had to stop for frequent rests and slowly fell behind schedule. Her slow pace was exacerbated by delays due to overcrowding. At the Hillary Step, a tough, narrow section of near-vertical ascent just before the summit, she was forced to wait for nearly 2 hours for her turn to climb. At the top of the Hillary Step, she encountered the owner of Utmost Adventure Trekking. He had completed his summit push and was on the way down. He told Shriya to turn around, that she was running late and risking everything by attempting to make it to the top now. But Shriya could not be persuaded. She was so close. She had dreamed of this for so long. She was going to attempt the summit. The owner gave her an extra bottle of oxygen and left her with the junior guides. She forged on ahead, and not long after, at the end of a grueling 19-hour climb, she did indeed reach the summit. It was around 2:30 p.m., half an hour past the recommended turnaround time, but she was elated. She unfurled a Canadian flag and posed for pictures. The news that she had reached the top went around the world, reaching her friends and family back home, who could not help but celebrate. Through sheer determination, Shriya had done the impossible. But now she was faced with a second impossible feat: getting back down, alive. After spending half an hour on the summit, she turned around and began a stumbling descent. By now, the light was failing, and the weather was worsening, with strong winds whipping up blinding snow. Her 2 Sherpas urged her on, even as her oxygen supplies ran low. Within hours, they were begging her to keep walking, as they supported her between them every step of the way. Shriya, in her turn, begged them not to leave her to die. Her guides escorted her as far as they physically could, but at 8,400 meters, or 27,559 feet, she stopped moving. It was now fully dark. Her guides were exhausted, low on supplies, and surrounded by howling winds. They could do nothing further. They left her and headed back to Camp 4 to raise the alarm. At this time, Shriya's climb had gone on so long that climbers were ascending for the next day's summit push. A group found Shriya, and attempts were made to revive her. They were unsuccessful. Shriya Shah-Klorfine had achieved her dream of standing at the roof of the world. But now, just hours later, she was dead. It took 10 days to recover her body, with climbers in the meantime having to skirt around her frozen remains. She was eventually retrieved and cremated. She was one of 11 climbers to die on the slopes of Everest that season. Looking back, the red flags were clear. Shriya was inexperienced. Her training, carried out in the Canadian countryside and in climbing gyms, had not prepared her for the realities of Everest. The guides she had hired lacked experience themselves, and the most qualified among them refused to take her, leaving her in the hands of less experienced climbers who may not have felt that they had the authority to force one of the company's first high-paying clients to turn around. Most of all, Shriya herself had not known her limitations, had not turned around when told to do so, had persisted, even when warned that she was risking her very life. Shriya Shah-Klorfine is remembered fondly for her determination, her iron will, and her steadfast pursuit of what was most important to her. Qualities that led her to live an extraordinary life, but qualities which also led to her death.